Welcome to Roll for Insight, the D&D podcast where we dive into the game, the lore, and the internet's favorite arguments. Grab your dice and your character sheet, and let's roll for insight. Hello, welcome to Roll for Insight. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the origin feat Musician out of the 2024 D&D Player's Handbook. So, Musician is an origin feat that is available at character creation by choosing the Entertainer origin, or by choosing it as a feat when you level up. Also, if you're using a background or origin from an older D&D version that doesn't provide a feat, you can take this as an origin feat of your choice. Now, this one is surprisingly, and I think it's surprising due to the name, it has a lot of combat utility and it can be really powerful, but it also has a fair amount of social and roleplay usage. So in this episode, we'll be covering the description of the origin feat from the Player's Handbook, we'll review some gameplay uses, plus some benefits and limitations of the feat, we'll pull some ideas and opinions from the internet, and last we'll end with some fun fact information about the feat. Okay, so first topic, origin feat Musician. It's available to the Entertainer origin, and you gain the following benefits. Instrument training. You gain proficiency with 3 musical instruments of your choice. And encouraging song. As you finish a short or long rest, you can play a song on a musical instrument with which you have proficiency and give heroic inspiration to allies who hear the song. The number of allies you can affect in this way equals your proficiency bonus. So a few clarifications on the description. Musician is one of the more deceptively simple origin feats because it interacts directly with heroic inspiration, which is already a very table-dependent mechanic. So not all tables use heroic inspiration, and some use it a lot more freely than others. So first, let's talk instrument training. You gain proficiency with 3 musical instruments of your choice. This part of the feat is mostly narrative and gives you some flavor and roleplay options, but it also helps do things like reinforce your character identity or supporting social encounters where it might give you justifications for performances and tavern gigs and ceremonies. But the real mechanical weight of this feat is not in the instrument side of things, it's encouraging song. The encouraging song is basically an engine that just pumps out inspiration for the table. And this is where a musician can either live or die at the chopping block of the useful origin feats. So, after you finish a short rest or a long rest, you play a song on the instrument you're proficient with, and you can give heroic inspiration to a number of allies equal to your proficiency bonus. The only side note on that is that allies must be able to hear the song. There's also some important clarifications. This is not an action or a bonus action or a reaction. It just happens at the end of a rest. So it doesn't require a roll, and you're not expending a limited resource beyond the actual rest itself. So that makes Musician a very consistent inspiration source for the table. Now, it also gives a lot of scaling with the proficiency bonus, so it naturally scales. At the early levels, you've got inspiration for 2 allies. In the mid levels, you've got inspiration for 3 to 4 allies. And then at high levels, 5 to 6 allies. And that really means that early game, you can really cover a few key players. And then mid to late game, you're almost always covering either everyone or at least everyone who matters with the inspiration. Now, as a reminder, the rules for heroic inspiration, the feat is assuming that your table actually uses inspiration. So as a quick refresher, it's a mechanic available in-game to re-roll the dice. So sometimes the DM will reward players with the use of heroic inspiration, and it might be from doing things like playing in character really well, or doing something entertaining or particularly heroic, or thinking of a unique solution to a problem. But with the heroic inspiration rules, a creature can only have one use of it at a time. So generally, heroic inspiration allows you to re-roll any die, and you must use that roll. But that can vary from table to table, so it's always good to get clarification on how and if you'll both generate and implement heroic inspiration. And that's going to be crucial for expectation setting for the usefulness of the feat. Now, looking at some gameplay uses for a musician, it's not a combat feat in the traditional sense, but it does directly improve combat consistency. So some of the combat uses, granting heroic inspiration for combat means that on average, more hits are going to land, more saving throws will succeed, and there's going to be fewer catastrophic failures because you have that reroll. And that's especially going to be strong when you know combat is coming, or you're entering a dungeon, or you're about to face a boss encounter where you know your saves might be tested. So Musician doesn't necessarily increase damage, but it increases the reliability. And a lot of players actually save their inspiration for key moments and key saving throws. Now, Musician also has a lot of exploration and utility uses outside of combat with the inspiration, because inspiration can also be used on things like skill checks and tool checks and other saving throws, like environmental ones. And that makes Musician very strong in the heist-style campaigns or the exploration-heavy campaigns, or where there's a lot of social intrigue. Because having a reliable way to generate inspiration at your table means that you can take risks more often, and you're going to fail less catastrophically and less often, and have that confidence to back up your party. And last, with the social uses and the roleplay usages, Musician fits really well into the social play because performances and the inspiration mechanic can justify getting the NPC attention and gathering crowds and giving good first impressions. And the inspiration can help you salvage bad situations if you roll a, terrible persuasion roll, or it can turn a tense negotiation back into your favor. Or it can prevent you from making a big social misstep and spiraling into a terrible catastrophe. So it gives a lot of options even when you're not in combat. So looking at the benefits overall of Musician, it's absolutely one of the most reliable sources of heroic inspiration, and scaling naturally with level can help benefit the entire party and not just the person taking the feat. And it does also encourage short rests, which can also be campaign or table dependent. Now, some limitations to Musician: you have to make sure you set expectations correctly, because the feat will lose a lot of value if your table forgets to use their inspiration or don't have a way to track it. And on the opposite side, if inspiration is already handed out constantly at your table, then this is going to feel redundant. And this really does encourage people to use their inspiration and not just save it for the important roles. Okay, so next area here, looking at some of the discussion board topics from the internet about the Musician origin feat. There's definitely a few very specific debates going on about this one. So something that's commonly brought up is that this is just free inspiration for characters at the table. And some people feel like that might devalue inspiration, and it just turns it into a buff for your party. And the counter argument to this is that yes, that's the point of the Musician feat, is to generate inspiration. So inspiration should be used and not hoarded like all the potions in your inventory. And that makes the argument seem less about the balance of the origin feat and more about just table philosophy and how you play the game. Now, another common take on this one is that the feat is useless at my specific table because we don't use inspiration. And that's a fair criticism, because Musician is only as good as the table's engagement with inspiration. If you don't use inspiration at the table, then yes, taking the 3 free instruments isn't going to feel very powerful. And then last, there are some DM concerns about the feat, because this might make players time their rests just to farm the inspiration before the big battles, and then encounters feel like they're going in pre-buffed. However, there's a lot of ways to counter that, because that's just how resources work. It makes inspiration another visible and predictable buff for your party, and you can use that if you're prepared for it. So again, that's more of a table culture issue, not a rules issue or a problem with the feat. Okay, now to wrap up, the fun fact information about the Musician origin feat. So Musician really taps into one of the oldest fantasy tropes of the songs that inspire courage in the party, and the marching chants and the war drums and the ballads that are sung before battle. And we even do it now today with pump-up playlists. That's kind of your own heroic inspiration. So historically, music has always been used to do things like boost morale and coordinate movement of armies and create that shared identity within a group. Now, earlier editions of D&D handled this almost exclusively through the Bard class, but the Musician origin feat breaks the class restriction of just the Bard being the musician in the group, and it lets any character be that morale engine without having to dip into the Bard class features directly. So where this really leaves our Musician origin feat, it's not flashy and it's not going to deal more damage specifically, but at the right table, it's fantastic as a pick, because it increases your consistency, it encourages teamwork, and it makes the inspiration feel like a mechanic of the game rather than an afterthought or a bonus only for a few key players. But again, Musician will only be as strong as your table's relationship with heroic inspiration. Well, that's it for this session of Roll for Insight. Thanks for listening, and thank you to all our supporters on patreon.com/rollforinsightpodcast. And we will See you next time.